Oh, maybe a few decades ago, getting up there now, I started asking the question about mainly initially at that time, it was traditional news. So it was local news, network news, programming, and the way in which certain groups seem to be associated with certain kinds of crime roles. And some of that was inspired by an author and professor named Robert Entman, and some other work by Mary Beth Oliver. And at the time, I was a graduate student, and I was reading some of that work and seeing, for instance, in Bob Entman's work, he looked at Chicago, and in Chicago, he mentioned how blacks seem to be associated with crime, and he talked about blacks not being named suspects, whereas whites were. He talked about mugshots showing up of blacks more than whites. And he basically attributed this to a media bias against blacks, where they were associated in an incorrect way with criminality. And I wanted to take that a step further and think really critically about what representation meant. And so I started thinking about misrepresentation as being two things: overrepresentation of a group with a role, or underrepresentation of a group with a role. And we use a lot of different kinds of indices or measures to try to figure out what that meant. So sometimes we just say, okay, let's just compare whites to blacks show up as perpetrators in the news, which is similar to what Aitman did. Sometimes we said, let's look at just black people or white people, and I'm skipping the let's just look at white people or black people like as one group. So like looking at just black people, do they show up more as officers or as criminals? Right. And then we also did the thing that you were hinting at, which is the last measure, where we took the percentages of blacks, whites, Latinos, and others who showed up as criminals or officers or as victims. And then we compared that to official reports. And what we found over the span of several years is that blacks were pretty strongly associated with criminality. And Latinos actually were largely invisible in a lot of these roles. But whites were consistently portrayed as either victims or as officers. So the more positive role, if you're thinking about crime, to occupy would be as an officer, somebody who's trying to intervene, or perhaps someone who's unfortunately victimized. Those were kind of strictly where whites showed up. They were, some of the things we could publish that were also interesting is that whites were like 100% of the judges. They were like 100% of the prosecutors that showed up. It's hard to publish that because of the technical things. I'm not, it's kind of hard to get into, of course, but one of the technical things is something called variation. So if there is no variation, we actually can't report that, right? But the lack of variation all moved in one direction, which is whites showed up in these really strong positive roles. That was kind of the historical thing that we did. We did do some updates, and what's really notable about the more recent work we've done in the last couple of years is that the Black Association, just purely with the perpetration role, has declined somewhat. And I actually attribute some of that to pushback from Black Lives Matter and from other online activist groups who've kind of pushed the media to conceive of Blacks and Black bodies in more nuanced ways, that they are not just criminals, but are sometimes victimized in a way. For instance, Trayvon Martin was victimized and shot. So I think that there's been somewhat of a change in the last several years with regards to Black depictions. Whites still are tend to be overrepresented as criminals, or at least are moving in the same kind of direction. We have other evidence that that's really still there. And in addition to that, Muslims and Latinos are being associated with other issues. So if you're a Muslim person, you're strongly associated with terrorism, overrepresented as terrorists in comparison to the terrorism that occurs in the United States. Most terrorism in the United States is committed by whites, overwhelmingly by white supremacist groups, radicalized white supremacist groups. Usually the average terrorist in America is ex-military, white male, oftentimes white supremacists or white nationalists, or they have different names. It's the same thing. So basically, that's basically what you find most of the time that's who commits violence or terrorism in the United States. However, the media overwhelmingly portrays terrorism and even local terrorism as being a Muslim problem. Secondly, Latinos and immigration. So whenever an immigration status is mentioned in the media, oftentimes it is associated with criminality in a way that is distorted. And in addition, undocumented immigrants are largely associated with Latinos, although they're not the only group in our country that is undocumented. So these are also distortions, if you will, in terms of overrepresentation. So when we see immigration, it's linked with crime. When we see undocumented immigration, it's linked with Latinos. When we see terrorism, that issue is linked with Muslims. And in the old days, if it was crime, it was largely associated with Blacks.